If I were to hire someone, as I have in the past, I would tell them, spend 2 weeks reading the memoranda, minutes of meeting, familiarize yourself with what went on insofar as they are revealed in minutes and memoranda. I didn't follow the same advice for myself. Why? Not because I was above doing it. I could have learned a lot. There wasn't any time. You will have to remember that when I joined Congress, the UJRA, but it was a committee of Congress, it was in January 1940. We were in the midst of the end result of the refugee movement, and we were in the beginning of the war period. It's true it was a phony war for 6 months, but it didn't take long before it was a real war, that is by June 1940. And it wasn't very long after that before we were faced with the perilous situation of the fear of an imminent invasion of England by the Nazis, which had a very important effect on the Jewish community, because members of the Jewish community, similar to the position of those of the non-Jewish community, sent their children, and many of them their wives, to Canada for fear of both bombings and actual invasion. So we had a lot of children to deal with and a lot of wives to deal with. I happened to have been, because I was active as the director of the UJRA, it was the United Jewish Relief Agency, the refugee agency at the time. No, it became War Relief a couple of years later. I was therefore also active in the Christian movement. I shouldn't call it the Christian movement, but I do so to make it in contradistinction to the Jewish ones, to the non-Jewish children and the non-Jewish women who came over here. However, my first days were made up of a daily background, but you must remember I didn't come to it fresh. I was part of it as a non-professional person for at least 3 years prior to that, certainly from 1937 on, so that I was quite familiar with many of the activities, plus the fact that in my volunteer days I was one of the founders of the Canadian Ort, which was one of the constituents of the UJRA. I was a member of the Baron de Hirsch board, which had something to do with these matters of refugee settlement. I was a member of the Canadian Jewish Congress Committee on Refugees, so it isn't as though I was plucked from a law office deeply immersed in the matters of collisions and the agony of collisions and tort actions and mortgages and hypothecs. Not at all, because part of my life, for the 3 years preceding when I took over, was spent as a volunteer in these very matters. When I came in, and when Mr. Bronfman came in, it wasn't possible that we would work out of. First of all, there wasn't room, and secondly, Mr. Bronfman had other ideas. So the part that I'm saying is more fun was for the hardcore members of the Canadian Jewish Congress, who were also on the Refugee Committee, who were also in the UJRA, to agree to move west of Blurry Street was a revolution. And they feared so much two things. One, that we were having meetings at the Montefiore Club, and two, that we were having premises on St. Catherine Street near Stanley Street. This was, in a geographic sense, trafe. And it took a lot of doing and a respect for Sam Bronfman to get that far. Then to add a third dimension, they were used to conducting their proceedings to some great extent in Yiddish. I was not, I won't even say fluent in Yiddish. I knew very little Yiddish. Not my fault, simply because it wasn't used at home. And therefore, the first things I had was to overcome the suspicions of the a very important section of the Canadian Jewish Congress, among the founders of the Canadian Jewish Congress. I'm not only talking of the labor Zionist people, I'm talking of people such as Hershwolowski of the Eagle, the people surrounding him, and the Verband people who weren't necessarily labor Zionists at all, in fact. Many of them were not. I'm talking about the leadership of the Polish Verband or the Landsmannschaft, whether it be the Kletzker or what have you. There must have been a dozen of them or more. And these people were used to dealing in a Jewish environment. Headquarters was usually St. Lawrence Boulevard, nothing like Stanley and Catherine Street and Stanley Street. So that I suffered from, I don't use the word suffering in the sense that I agonized or that I had nightmares or sleepless nights, which I didn't. Perhaps that's not to my credit, but the facts are I didn't. But what I did have was a feeling that there was a friendship but a hostility, that I'd have to prove myself as being really a Jew. I must tell you a story about this. I was interviewed on one occasion by a man by the name of Chaim Shoskis, whose name you know. He was a sort of a traveling ambassador for the JIAS. He came to Montreal and he wanted to see me. It was probably in 39. And no, it was probably in 40 or 41. And he wrote a book, as he always did, write books about his travels and so on. And he tells a story of how, I think this is significant, of how he came to Montreal and he heard that one person by the name of Saul Hayes was director of the refugee organization. And since the JIAS had considerable interest in all aspects of refugee work, he wanted to see me. I'm glad to say it was never a very difficult matter to see me. I was always anxious and see people and hospitable to them. And his piece about his visit to Montreal goes something as follows. While it's true I didn't memorize it, I'm giving you a pretty accurate paraphrase. He said he had an appointment to see me. He was ushered into the office, and he met the epitome of a British civil servant who seemed to be more at home with Chaucer, Spenser, Shakespeare than he did with Peretz or Mendele Moses Sephorim or Shalom Aleichem. And he said that I was very proper and very elegant. I use his term, not my own. I wouldn't admit to that, but that's the term he used. And then he came out with this statement, which is why I'm telling it to you. He said, when I began to discuss the fate of the Jews and the Jewish problem, his eyes took on a burning zeal, and then I could see das Pintele Yid. And I think he was right in this assessment, because while I may have had, through no fault of mine, an austere look at things, I was so deeply immersed in Jews and their problems, which were my own problems, never having departed for one instant from my Jewish birth and Jewish background, and as I told you before, my Jewish shul life. It wasn't hard for me to be a Pintele Yid. But it's an interesting story.